Goedemiddag op deze Koningsdag vanuit Amsterdam, Engeland en Zweden voor dit debat over de film The Man Who Shouldn't Be King. We zullen dit debat in het Engels doen, omdat we zo ook verstaanbaar zijn voor onze vrienden in Engeland en Zweden. We gaan het hebben over, zoals gezegd, deze documentaire. En daarom ga ik vanaf nu verder in het Engels. With us are Graham Smith, who is the head of Republic in the UK, the Republican Society. Good afternoon. How are you?
Hi, Floris. How are you?
Very fine. It's a sunny day and it's very quiet, actually, though it's King's Day.
Happy King's Day.
Well, thank you very much. With us is Olle Nietvit. I have to pronounce this well. Did I pronounce that well?
No, it's good. It's good.
Good. You're from the Republic. You should help me here.
Republikaanska föreningen.
Yes, that's it. The Republican Society in Sweden. With both of you, we will debate on this documentary, The Man Who Shouldn't Be King, made by the British Republican Society Republic. For everybody following us today and staying home, as you should, you are very much invited to debate with us. Leave your comments on YouTube and on Facebook, so we can get into all your questions and your remarks so far. Starting with you, Graham. I know you. I think most people in Great Britain know you. People in Holland might not. But you're the head of the British Republican Society of Republic. You are the spokesman of the Republican Society, and you are quite well in the British media. I've seen you a lot on BBC, heard you a lot in newspapers and on the radio. But as it turns out, you are a filmmaker as well.
Well, of a sort, yeah. We've spent the last few years making this documentary about Charles. It focuses on him for two reasons. We started off wanting to challenge his supposed ownership of the Duchy of Cornwall, but also we want to focus on him because he's going to be our king very soon, and he, as an individual, raises all sorts of problems. There's a lot of question marks about what sort of king he's going to be, and I think that there's a lot of evidence in the way he's behaved as Duke of Cornwall about, the attitude towards tenants that live on his land, the attitude towards the government and the way he lobbies. So, yeah, it's just a way of using Prince Charles really as a sort of a lesson about the failings of monarchy and why we really need to be able to choose our next head of state.
That's rather interesting. Is such a movie, is that effective? And I'll turn to you, Olle. Obviously, you haven't made a movie yet about the monarchy in Sweden, but what kind of effect do you think such a movie can have?
Well, of course, I feel like it could be a very effective way to get the Republican message across, in the sense that it's easily digestible. And we have, in Sweden, we have a book which deals with a lot of the sort of royal corruption, but it really hasn't gained the momentum or traction that we hoped, or we actually thought it would. But it's also because it's probably not as digestible as a movie. And so I mean, I would love to do a movie instead after watching this one, because I thought it was really well produced. So yeah.
Obviously, the British Crown is very well known. Probably just a little bit better than the royals in Sweden. Still, there is a lot of controversy around the British monarchy. Do you think it can be effective making a movie about the Swedish monarchy?
I actually think so, yes. And as I go back to the fact that I feel like that's a very easily digestible format for most people. So if you expose a lot of the corruption or the inner workings that most people don't know, I feel like that would be a good way to sort of enlighten people and to get them on board with our message.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Just interrupting you, as people are following us on Facebook and on YouTube, please leave all your questions and your comments below. If you have any question for me from the Dutch Republican Society, het Republikeins Genootschap, or for Graham of the Republican Society in Britain, Republic, or Olle of the Swedish Republican Society, which obviously the name I can't pronounce, as Swedish is just a little bit more difficult than English. We're talking about the documentary, The Man Who Shouldn't Be King, about Prince Charles. And as you already noted, Graham, you started out with making a documentary about the particular what power holds on the islands and certain possessions he has. It does go into finances as well. And if I'm not mistaken, and if I've made my notes well, the British monarchy costs approximately £335 million per year.
Yeah, 345 million. I mean, that's a conservative estimate. It's probably more than that. The problem is that they don't tell us all of the figures. They say that they cost us around £40 million every year, plus at the moment for the next few years another £40 million, so that they can spend money on fixing Buckingham Palace, which is in a pretty poor state of disrepair. So the £345 million that we've come up with, which is detailed, and I'll go through a couple of the points in a moment, but there is a report in full on our website, but that is so much different to the 40 million they claim, because they just don't admit huge amounts of costs. It's estimated that the security for the royal family is in the region of about £100 million, which is, again, probably a conservative estimate. The Duchy of Cornwall that I mentioned, that is public land, and that makes about £20 million profit, which we allowed Prince Charles to keep every year. A similar amount is allowed for the Queen from the Duchy of Lancaster. And when they go around the country visiting places, cutting ribbons and so on, that costs the local councils and local police forces a lot of money as well. So it is an estimate, but we're fairly certain it's conservative. So it's a very expensive institution.
As we are celebrating King's Day here in the Netherlands today, celebrating, not all of us, but it is King's Day today. A lot of people, I get a lot of comment from people in the Netherlands, friends who say, well, you know, a monarchy obviously costs a lot of money, but compare it to a presidency, that costs a lot of money as well. What do you have to say to them, Graham?
Well, you've got to compare like for like. I mean, if you compare, say, the Dutch monarchy with the US presidency, then obviously the US is more expensive, but that's not what we're comparing. You've got to compare it with, say, the German presidency or the Irish presidency, and it is a lot cheaper. It's certainly cheaper than the British monarchy. But also, it's not, I guess the question is, would a Dutch president or a British president be as expensive as a royal? Now, the reason why royals are more expensive is because they can get away with spending money that others wouldn't get away with. I think it's very unlikely that an elected official or an appointed official who is accountable would spend the kind of money that royals do, because they would be thrown out of their job.
No. It's £345 million, according to your estimate, the total cost of the British monarchy. Here in the Netherlands, the Republican Society, het Republikeins Genootschap, made an estimate 2 years ago saying that the total cost of the monarchy is approximately €350 million. So that's rather comparable.
Yep.
How is that for Sweden, Olle?
I feel that's comparable if you take into account the population and whatnot. We estimate that our monarchy costs about somewhere in the vicinity of 115, 120 million euros. And of course, this is large. I mean, depends on what kind of assumptions you make when you do the estimate and what you choose to count and not. But I feel like that's a comparable sum of money to both the Netherlands and the UK. So yeah, as Graham said, just the security alone costs so much. So yeah.
It's a lot of money. For people joining us right now, I'll be repeating this once in a while. If you join us now via Facebook or on YouTube. We are speaking in English. There's nothing wrong with your sound. We are debating a movie made by the British Republican Society Republic about Prince Charles. It's called The Man Who Shouldn't Be King. And with us are Graham of Republic and Ola of the Swedish Republican Society. If you have any question or comment, please leave them below on YouTube or on Facebook so we can debate about your questions might they arise. We were talking about the finances. You go into the political power as well. As I understood, and as over the last couple of days, again, I have been debating the monarchy a lot. People say, people around me say that they, well, obviously, they cost money. The president costs a lot of money, but they don't have real power. How about before we go to the Dutch and the Swedish, how's that for the British monarchs? Do they have any power, or has that changed or shifted over the last couple of years?
No, I mean, as you probably know, we don't have a written constitution. We've never gone through that moment of huge change where we've written it all down. So it's kind of evolved since the late 18th century, when, of course, William of Orange invaded, and with the acquiescence of the British Parliament, and the upshot of that is that there are two aspects to this question. Firstly, the Queen, in theory, has huge amounts of power, but that is royal prerogative power, which is exercised by government ministers. Now, that is a problem because it's far too much power that is not directly accountable to Parliament, which is not properly scrutinized, and it's quite excessive. It makes the power of the government quite disproportionate. I would say that the British government is one of the most powerful in terms of domestic policy because of the royal powers that they have access to. On the other hand, the royals themselves and the monarch have power to influence, to interfere, and to also to lobby on their own for their own interests. So Prince Charles is the main and most obvious example of this, which is another reason why we flagged it up as a big issue in the film, but a reason why we also have concerns about Charles. So on the one hand, he will lobby on a whole range of different issues, whether it's the environment or education or health. He can do that in secret. He can do that with complete access to government papers, so he knows well in advance what ministers are talking about. And he can write letters that no one can ever know about. And we know from various anecdotal stories over the years that this has had an influence. They can also lobby for their own interests. So they've successfully lobbied to increase the secrecy and to improve their financial arrangements. So there are a number of different details in the way that works, but there is it all is using power that is granted under the royal banner, as it were. So there's prince's consent, queen's consent, and the royal prerogative, and it all kind of creates these a number of different serious problems.
I know that the Dutch monarchs obviously don't have direct power anymore. That was all changed 170 years ago when we got a constitution. We now live in the so-called constitutional monarchy. But still, I think what I see in the documentary is that maybe they don't have any direct power comparable with the Dutch, but yep. Still there is a lot of influence.
Yeah, I mean, the Queen can't say, right, we will now introduce a new policy on education, obviously, but we know that Prince Charles has lobbied on all these issues and has been successful in various cases. Now, of course, we have a devolved government in Scotland, and we know that we know what Prince Charles's views are on education. He set up a charity to promote those views, and then we know that the Scottish government under Alex Salmond adopted policies which are in line with those views, and we know that Prince Charles lobbies the Scottish government as he does with the British government. So we also know that homeopathy and other forms of alternative medicine have been available on the National Health Service, despite the fact that everybody in the National Health Service, more or less, thinks that this is a waste of public money. Now, whatever you think of homeopathy or alternative medicine, the NHS in this country should be run based on what the doctors advise and not what Prince Charles thinks. And yet it's been said by one of the leading experts on homeopathy, a scientist called Ed Ernst, who has researched this, that one of the reasons why homeopathy remains available, or has done, I think it's now being phased out, is because of royal interference. So, and the Queen, I believe, as well as Charles, have used alternative medicine. So we know that there is an element of very direct interference and influence, which has an impact on government policy.
But you say interference, you talk about, well, I myself mentioned influence. They have influence, but does that, does the movie show that their particular influence actually affects policy? Can you say that, well, policy has changed because of the influence of the king or the queen?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here. Again, is that there is specific policies such as the provision of homeopathy or education policy, which we know has been altered or introduced because of lobbying from Prince Charles or his charities, which work on his behalf. But then there are a whole load of laws which have been amended specifically for him. So the Duchy of Cornwall, which he is allowed to run as if it's his own private little empire, has all sorts of legal exemptions. Now, some of those laws are tailored so that the law doesn't apply to them. Other laws are tailored so that it does apply to them. But if they break the law, there's no sanction, there's no consequence. So, for example, if you are a leaseholder in this country, which means that you own the property that you live in, but you don't own the land that it's on, you have certain rights in terms of buying the land under your house. If you happen to live on land owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, Prince Charles, you don't have that right because they made sure that that law didn't apply to Prince Charles. The most bizarre example is that we have a law in this country against causing nuclear explosions. I'm not quite sure why, but nuclear explosions. Now, for some reason, nuclear explosions. So if for some reason Prince Charles wanted to detonate a nuclear bomb, he is not covered by that law, and therefore it would not. He couldn't be prosecuted under it, which is bizarre. But I guess he'd be prosecuted for something else. But I mean, there are a long list of laws, some of which are quite serious in terms of planning, land use, and rights to minerals and that sort of thing. So there is a real impact on the other people's lives, people that are affected by the way these laws are managed on land that is owned by the duchy.
How's that for Sweden, Ola? As I understood, Sweden is a so-called constitutional monarchy as well. The crown's power is held by the constitution. Do they have any political power, or do they envy political power?
I'd be hard pressed to speculate in their personal feelings towards it, but as you say, we are also one of the constitutional monarchies, and our constitution in this regard is fairly new. It was revised in the mid-70s and replaced the old 1809 constitution, and that severely restricted the political power of the monarchy. And in essence, it was a compromise between conservatives who still wanted a strong monarchy and more liberal and social democratic parties that wanted to replace it with a republic. So they compromised and held sort of a ceremonial monarchy. That's not to say that they don't have any political influence. The king is still the sort of ceremonial head or chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He officially opens up the parliamentary year every fall and so on. But compared to the British royals, then the political influence of the Swedish monarchs are officially very restricted. However, I mean, as I said, they still wield a whole lot of informal powers, and that, of course, comes with corruption and nepotism. And one of the major things that they are exempt from is the transparency that is generally held for all other sort of state entities, which means we don't really know where our money goes, and we can't really tell what they do because they won't share that information. They're exempt from that Transparency Act. So no, they don't hold much official political power or influence, but they could still wield a lot of informal ones.
All right, interesting. For people joining us right now, we have a debate about the documentary "The Man Who Shouldn't Be King," produced by the British Republican Society Republic. Joining us is the head of that society, Graham Smith, and Ola from Sweden, who is a member and part of the board of the Swedish Republican Society. We have more and more people joining us from the Dutch Antilles. I see some reactions coming in from the very south of our country. If you have any questions, just drop them below on YouTube, Facebook, so we can debate them. I've got quite some questions of the head of the Dutch Republican Society. He's asking, obviously, the monarchy in every country is popular, as it's very much promoted, and it's been promoted. Quite recently, we've had a poll here in the Netherlands around King's Day, asking how popular is the monarchy, and as it turns out, approximately 2/3 of the people are in support of the monarchy. Just a quarter is in favor of the republic. How's that for Sweden and Britain? To start with Britain.
Well, it's a more complicated picture, and it's worth doing some polling of your own, because sometimes different questions they won't change the headline figure, but they can sort of reveal some interesting detail. So it's, broadly speaking, 75% of the British population want to keep the monarchy, and it's roughly 20% that want to get rid of it. However, when you do a little bit of digging around in terms of how interested people are, whether they really care that much about this issue, then you start to find that support is fairly high, but it's also quite shallow, and people are open-minded about it to a large extent, and interested in possibly changing their minds if they're given a reason to do so. And we've had quite a lot of big events, as you might have noticed, over the last 10 years. And all of those big events, so there was the wedding of Prince William and Kate in 2011, the Jubilee in 2012, the birth, William and Kate's first baby in 2013. Then you had the wedding of Harry and Meghan a couple of years ago. All of these events, the polling shows that the vast majority of people are not that interested and don't really care that much. And we did some polling around the time of the Harry and Meghan wedding, which showed that most people don't have very strong feelings about any of the individuals. It's roughly 50-50 as to whether people would care that much if it did go. So there are a lot of details in there, and I do think that I noticed there was someone asking about younger people, and I think that there is some extent a growth of opposition to the monarchy amongst younger people. Whether that is sustained, I don't know, but I think that certainly in the UK there are various signs that opinion is weakening, even if the headline figure isn't going down.
Ola, you are obviously the youngest of us three. As I understood, you're in the end of your 20s?
Yes, correct. I'm 28.
You are 28. Are you one of many young Republicans in Sweden, or is it quite hard to
I would say that, okay, so we had a number crunching institute came up to us and said, okay, so we did the math, right? And if the trend continues, the decreasing trend for like support of monarchy, then you will have a majority by 2040. So of course you can, if you chart the trends, you can see that the official support for monarchy lowers. Oh, and this goes back decades, right? However, as Graham said, this is also depends a lot on how you phrase questions, right? So it's hard to do a certain polling of this. But one thing that I would like to acknowledge in this is that while we've had a couple of decades where each generation has been sort of more liberal and less conservative than the previous generation, and I'm a millennial, and we might be a little more conservative than the preceding generation, but mostly like more liberal in most ways. What we see, and this is where my political science background comes in, is that Generation Z or Generation Z, meaning people born about 95, 96 and onwards now until early 2000s, they are more conservative than previous generations, which could in essence mean that we see a backlash in this, and that's what I'm afraid of. Because honestly, just looking at the sort of political conscious class of youngsters today, you definitely see a conservative backlash. So it's hard to see, it's hard to know if this trend of decreasing support for the monarchy is actually gonna continue in the coming 10, 15 years, which is sad in a lot of ways, but it's something that we need to be aware of.
Well, it's quite funny that last year was the very first time that the Dutch public broadcaster NOS did investigation among the popularity among different age groups, and as it turns out, younger people are less in favor of the monarchy, and approximately 50% of all young people do not care for the monarchy as it is, meaning that some are Republican, another part is a monarchist, but still says, no political power, just a ceremonial role. 50% is quite a lot. Yet you see that the older people get, the more traditional they get, the more support they will have for the monarchy. I always found that a very, very particular phenomenon. You turn older, you start loving the crown. Help me here. I need an explanation for this.
Well,
yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, but isn't that sort of the ultimate expression of, as you grow older, you also kind of grow more conservative and less radical?
I think it's just, I mean, to some extent, it's just natural that, as you get older, you have children, you have mortgage or whatever, and your concerns become more personal and immediate, and you think about the education system or the economy and so on, and so you don't indulge yourself in bigger issues that might not have an immediate impact on your life. That's fine, and I do think that it's been said for many years in this country that the younger people are more likely to support getting rid of the monarchy, but then of course those younger people become older people, and then the next generation of younger people are more likely to support getting rid of the monarchy. But this is why we campaign, because the objective is to try and lock that in and get people to not change their mind. So they may well think, well, this is no longer my top priority because I'm no longer free to worry about these things. I've got children and a job and whatever, but I still agree. I still think that I haven't lost that. And so I think that there's a job of kind of making the issue mainstream, making the view mainstream, making it okay to be Republican, so that people don't feel it's a radical thing that you do in your misspent youth, and that it's okay to carry on supporting a republic as you get older, even if it may not be your number one issue when other things come up.
For everybody joining us right now, we are halfway in an interview about the documentary, The Man Who Shouldn't Be King, a documentary made by the British Republican Society Republic. Of the British Republican Society, we have Graham joining us in the debate, as Ola from the Swedish Republican Society. We are debating the documentary, as said, but we are debating the monarchy and the favor of the monarchy as well, to see if there is a comparison between the different countries in Europe that have a monarchy. We were just debating the fact that younger people tend, as polls show in the Netherlands, tend to be less in favor of the monarchy. I still have a point there. Because Ola, you said, well, as you grow old, you lose more of your progressive image, and then younger people tend to become more conservative as they grow up. But still, I think being in favor of a republic or a monarchy is something very principled. You don't throw that overboard as you grow old.
No, but I feel like Graham had an excellent point there about this is not something that really affects you in your daily life. You start worrying about schools and stuff like that for your children. So it might be that the issue takes a back seat to other more pressing issues for you, and your radical side becomes a little more moderated.
I think if I could just jump in very quickly, Floris. I mean, the other thing is that this is why it's so important to make it a material problem that needs to be fixed as well, because people who might just on principle think, well, this is something which definitely needs to change, and I can put some energy into this when I've got more time in my 20s. But if you're saying, well, this is a real problem, it needs to be fixed, and there's all sorts of areas, whether it's misuse of money or constitutional or whatever, then you're going to hold on to some of those supporters. And going back to what was said about people being more conservative, we have lots of conservative supporters, and we try and embrace that as well, because we know that we need people to see this as an issue that isn't attached to the radical young or to the left or whatever. It has to be something which anybody can get on board with. And I just the other day did a podcast which is now live with Julia Hartley-Brewer, who's quite a well-known radio presenter and journalist in this country, known for supporting Brexit and known for supporting this government, the Conservative government and so on. But she's absolutely 100% a Republican. So that's a useful voice to get out there and say, well, this is not something which is confined to the young or to the left.
We are still in this debate. For might you join in or have just joined in. If you have any question for Graham of the Republic Society in Great Britain or Ola from the Republican Society in Sweden, just leave your comments down below. I see one coming right now. Today is quite a warm day. Let me go before we go to Hans Maasse, who has asked us a question. It's quite a warm day. Originally, we had King's Day planned, the celebration of the birthday of the King in the Netherlands. Out of the Corona crisis, we can't, and we're debating at home online about the failure of the monarchy and need to get to a republic. Hans Maasse mentioned a little bit earlier in the comments that obviously King's Day is being used as a promotional tool. The royal family travels through the country every year, visits one or more cities to promote themselves, promote the institution, and the whole thing is very much televised and used to explain how wonderful and normal these people are. How's that for Sweden? Do you have a King's Day? Do you have any other national celebration around the King?
Well, not in such. We like April 30th is our King's birthday, and we celebrate that, but it's not because of the King. We have Walpurgis then, so that's an old tradition. But I would say the most eye-catching of these sort of propaganda things that you mentioned is that at the end of each year, our public service television corporation, they televise a sort of program called The Year of the Royals, where they basically have this production where they follow the royals for the entire year, and like, this is what they did. Oh, look how great that was, and how cozy. It's really just a star portrait of a royal family, and that happens every year towards end of December.
Yeah. Interesting thing is, if you look at how the monarchs in the Netherlands are portrayed, it's very much about the person. It's very much about Maxima, the queen. It's about Willem-Alexander. It's about their children. Thus, creating some kind of cloud around the monarchy. Not talking about the monarchy itself, the institution, but rather about these people, making any further discussion rather impossible, because if you are not in favor of the monarchy, you're basically saying, I don't like these people. Is that the case in Britain as well?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I think that we have a lot of this nonsense royal reporting, lots of stupid documentaries that, you know, done by journalists, but there's no journalistic merit or integrity to them. It's just puff pieces to promote them, and it's all very dishonest. But our media, I think, has a curious relationship with our royals. They like to go along with it, particularly our broadcasters, but the press are quite happy to have a go when they think it'll sell papers. And I think that in the past, it's certainly been a lot more difficult to criticize individual royals or even the monarchy, because it was tied up with these two issues. And this is why we've always, as long as I've been involved in the Republic, I've always made a point of criticizing the royals, so long as it's fair, so long as it's in the same sort of by the same measure that we might criticize a politician, because you have to get people used to the idea that they are a fair game. You know, the shock value wears off, and people start to get used to the fact that, okay, there are these people that make legitimate criticisms. And as long as it is legitimate and not personal, then it's fine. Now, sometimes, you know, you may have seen that the Queen delivered a message to the British people a couple of weeks ago regarding the coronavirus. It was a pretty dire message, but the coverage around it was fawning, and, you know, it's all, oh well, you know, wasn't this wonderful? And a politician couldn't possibly have made this kind of message, despite the fact that it was harking back to the war when a politician was making lots of much better speeches. But I tweeted just a few minutes beforehand, before it went live, saying, from the Republic account, saying, you know, the Queen is a public figure like anyone else, and she should be held to the same sort of standards as politicians, held accountable, and so on. That had a very large positive reaction, but also a very large negative one, including a well-known journalist, Piers Morgan, who retweeted it and swore at us for daring to criticize. Well, it wasn't even a criticism, to be honest. It was just a point about the fact that she is, as much as anyone, open to criticism and scrutiny. So, yeah,
can I paraphrase and basically say that media say any criticism against the monarchy, they say, well, that's a personal attack, and you shouldn't be doing that because these people can.
Not necessarily. No, I mean, it depends on what it is you're saying and who it is you're talking about. The Queen, more so. I think that if you criticize the Queen, people are not keen on that. But if you criticize Prince Charles, then that these days that's a lot more acceptable. And part of that is because our press is a lot more. Well, I don't know whether it's more robust than other press, but I mean, it's certainly very happy to go on the attack against people like Charles if there's a story. But also because we've been, you know, working to make the point all the time that you know, that it's perfectly okay to criticize these people, and that's been going on for some time. I mean, Prince Andrew is the obvious example, although that, you know, that is a pretty awful example in terms of the allegations against him. But Prince Harry has been criticized a lot over leaving the royal family. Prince Edward was criticized a lot 20 years ago, and even Prince Harry and Kate have been criticized from time to time. But it just really depends on what's being said and done, and which bit of the media is commenting.
Yeah. If you have just joined in, we are debating the documentary "The Man Who Shouldn't Be King" with the head of the British Republican Society, Graham Smith. With us as well is Olle Nyqvist, who is a member and board member of the Swedish Republican Society. Republic has just quite recently launched this documentary. If people haven't seen this yet, it's out on YouTube. I believe that we will already have leave a link in this debate. So if people haven't seen it, go and see it. I do have a question though. As the Dutch Republican Society, obviously the British are not supported by the government. Though you have a political view, you don't get any subsidies from the state in what you do, so your funding is limited. But still, make a movie, that's quite an expensive project, I would presume. Why make a movie?
Well, we raised money for it specifically, and one of the reasons is that if you do a project like that, it's much easier to raise money, which then also covers other costs as well. Helps us to sort of, it becomes a vehicle for the wider campaign. But ultimately, there isn't a film like it, so we get the opportunity to say, to decide what gets said, who gets interviewed, and it does help people to see, to sort of hear the message much more clearly than it might do if they just caught us for a minute on the national news. So it's a number of reasons for making the movie, I suppose. Is one, it helps to give us a vehicle for saying more about the campaign. It does actually help us to fundraise, but also then it helps to give people an opportunity to find out more without having to sort of catch us on the news or come to an event. And that movie now is, of course, available on our YouTube channel, so people can watch it, and we'll be watching it for many months and years to come.
Graham, who do you focus on? Are these your members, just showing them, this is what we came up with, or would you like to reach out to a broader public, maybe informing them?
No, yeah, absolutely. Broader public. So I mean, as well as our membership. So obviously, it does help to galvanise an interest in our membership. A lot of them have probably heard the issues before, but for a lot of people who haven't engaged with the public before, a lot of these issues will be new, and they won't necessarily understand that Prince Charles does all this kind of thing, or how much it costs, or whatever. And a lot of people are told by the media that the Duchy of Cornwall, for example, is a private estate that belongs personally to Prince Charles, which isn't true. So it sort of gives people a fresh perspective. The original plan was to hold a number of screenings up and down the country, and we managed to do, I think, 3 of those at the beginning of this year before the lockdown kicked in. So we had to cancel all that, and instead put it on YouTube and promoted it through that. And we will be promoting it further through the media as well, but obviously the virus and the lockdown and everything else has disrupted that a bit. But it's over 10,000 views, and we will be doing more to promote it to get that number far higher. So I think it's just, I guess, for most of the time, if people want to find out about it, they either have to read a book or read our website, and they might catch a few bits on YouTube or wherever. And this is an opportunity to showcase the whole argument, but to frame it around the person who's going to be the next king.
Yeah. One might say that you are a Republican talking about the monarchy. This is not really objective. Obviously, you will portray Charles as somebody who is doing wrong, and you should get rid of the whole idea of monarchy as soon as possible. What would you say to them? Obviously, you have a certain standpoint in this.
Yes, and I don't. We make no claim to objectivity. What we do make a claim to is accuracy, and a lot of these things are misrepresented in the mainstream media. And our film is very clearly a Republican film. It's very clearly made by us. It starts with a piece. A bit of footage of me on a BBC radio program, and it's very clearly, I mean, the title makes it clear that this is not objective, but I think it is factual. It is relying on some serious commentary from people that know what they're talking about, and it's what is missing from it is all the sort of fluff and fawning that you normally get on the BBC, for example, where people will simply go on about Prince Charles's charity work or whatever it is, or the cheese you might make in Cornwall. But this is actually looking at the serious issues, and and I think people will take from that what they want. Not everything has to be objective. But this is an opinion. This is a point of view. But it is the film is really putting that point of view across in a way that says there are serious reasons for having this point of view.
Yeah, you say it's not your main goal to be objective. This obviously is a subjective view about the monarchy. I must say that in debate with people, whether they be Republicans or monarchists, people always say, well, you are obviously not the one to judge, as you are a Republican. So basically, you being a Republican just cancels you as a potential as somebody in a debate. How do you feel about that, Ola? Are you being taken seriously in debate in the media?
Yes. I mean, I was just talking to someone, a former MP, who was making a similar point in a podcast that we've got coming up, that quite often say, oh, well, you would say that you're a Republican. It's like, well, the real answer is, well, you would say what you're saying because you're a monarchist. I mean, why does that make a difference? I mean, the point is, I'm not saying that we should get rid of the monarchy because I'm a Republican. I'm a Republican because I've looked at the monarchy and I think, well, this doesn't make any sense, And I'm not making this film because there's some little bit in my head that says you are a Republican, therefore this is what you think. I look at these facts and I tell them as I see them, and I always keep coming back to the conclusion that this is not an institution that we should be supporting. So if anybody says that, just throw it right back in their face. They can't say, look, you can't discuss this issue because you are a Republican. You are a Republican because you've thought about it and you've come to a conclusion which is entirely valid. And if they are supporting the monarchy, then why is that the default position that also can't be challenged?
Yeah. How about you, Ola? Do you have problems getting your points through, or do people, as they do here in the Netherlands and obviously in Britain, say, well, as you are a Republican, obviously you have a very subjective way of looking at the world, and your points are rather not taken seriously?
No, I feel like I'm being taken seriously if I discuss this. I mean, sure, you have some ardent monarchy supporters that are always going to do some jabs at you, and there are some people who might think that this is not an issue worthwhile to engage in. It's good the way it is, but if I feel like for the most part, since most people either don't care or have very vague opinions on it, if we engage them on the subject, we're taken seriously and they can understand our side of the story, even if they don't necessarily agree with us or they don't really have an opinion at all. Honestly, the people who would make fun of you for this or say that our opinions are invalid, they're a very minute minority, I would say. That I don't feel sure they're often a loud minority, but for the most part, it's a fairly okay climate to debate in. I very rarely find myself not being taken seriously.
As we continue our debate and are already almost 50 minutes live on Facebook and YouTube, I would like to ask everybody following our discussion, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below so we can talk about them. If you have some direct questions to Ola or Graham, leave them below. And just saying hi, that's always very nice. I know that quite some people have the urge to go outside because it's very sunny in the Netherlands. I see that people comment my voice. Well, thank you very much about that. But leave your questions as well, as I think this is a very interesting opportunity to talk about the monarchy, about republicanism with not only the Dutch Republican Society, but with the Swedes and the British as well. While watching the documentary, Graham, I was very much surprised as how much people were actually willing to speak out. Whereas I believe that a lot of people here in the Netherlands believe that once you speak out against monarchy or reveal something, this will lower your chances getting a great job or lower your chances doing anything. It's not very smart speaking out against the monarchy. Did you while making this documentary, did you have any serious backstand? Did you have people working against you not to come out?
Well, I mean, there were certainly people that we asked to contribute to the film who declined, particularly who, ordinary people who happened to be living on Dutchy land. And this was commented on in the film that people are scared of the Dutchy specifically. So they don't, if they're living on their land, they don't want to cause any trouble. There were some politicians we asked that declined, even though they might have had something useful to say. So there is an element of that, but I think there are plenty of people these days, more than there were maybe 30 years ago, who are quite happy to speak up. So yeah, there is still an issue. I don't know what people's worries are. I suppose they might still worry about jobs and so on. I mean, there have been people in the past that have got themselves into hot water. There's a DJ, I think, back at the time of the royal wedding in 2011 that got into hot water about making some comments. There's a comedian that made a rather rude comment about the Queen. He got into a lot of trouble, and even the Church of England vicar, I think he was, in London, that got into some trouble. But on the whole, there are enough people that are willing to speak out. But again, it's the challenge to make it mainstream so that people feel able to talk about it. This used to be the case in Australia, for example. And it's worth looking at that example where back in the 80s, you might have had a similar reaction because of the Labour government in the 90s pushing and then getting a referendum. Everything changed, and now it's much easier to be a Republican than a monarchist in Australia. So it's kind of reversed. So yeah, I think there are issues in terms of whether anybody actually tried to stop us from making it. No, not really. But I mean, the Duchy of Cornwall became aware that we were doing it, and they phoned us fairly quickly and tried to find out what we were up to.
What did they say? You're making a movie. Don't do that.
Yeah, well, we were on the Scilly Isles, which are just off the west coast of Cornwall, and we contacted the local representative of the Duchy, asking for an interview because a lot of people on the Scilly Isles who are tenants of the Duchy were complaining about the way they're treated, and we got through to this local sheriff's representative or secretary or whatever, and they said, "Oh, we'll take your message." And an hour later, someone in London that phoned us saying, "What are you doing? And can we find out more about the film you're making?" And then they just simply tried to tell us that everything is happy and rosy, and the Duchy have a great relationship with their tenants, and their representative wasn't going to do interviews. I think they even claimed that they never do interviews, even though we'd seen such an interview on online. So yeah, they were just very wary of what we were doing, and I'm sure that I'm sure they have watched the film to see whether there's anything
you haven't
libelous.
Any proactive counter measures of the Crown, of anybody who's in favor of the Crown in Britain, of you making a movie?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that if we are successful in getting it a much higher profile, then you may find a reaction. But again, it's a film that is, yes, it comes from a Republican perspective, but it's based in fact. It's accurate. It would be hard to really do anything that might challenge it. And I think the royals themselves would be very, very reluctant to do anything in terms of any legal challenge, because that would ensure overnight that everybody knows about us, and our membership would rocket through the roof if they did that.
Yeah. While we debate, questions come in. I even have people texting me for me and us to react. Please leave your comments below on Facebook and YouTube. We've got one question as to, we are debating republicanism. We are debating the monarchy in Sweden and Great Britain and Holland. Thomas Jollens is saying, you can't compare these countries. Obviously, the monarchy is a little bit different, as I understood from his question, and it has no sense of actually comparing them. As we all are gathered in the Association of European Republican Movements, the AERM, of which the logo is just is just in that right corner of your screen. How about that? How about that? Do the different monarchies? Is there such a major difference between them? Oliver.
Yeah, sure. I feel like there. Just seeing this movie, I feel like there's a big difference in the sense that while the Swedish monarchy disposed of a lot of land and whatnot, they do not wield this power, to my knowledge. I'd be hard pressed to find an example where they have tenants in this way, or it wouldn't surprise me, but I can't really come up with an example of just relating to Thomas's question here, if something comparable to Cornwall or Lancaster that I would find. So and just as Graham said, the UK doesn't have a formal constitution. We actually have a formal constitution which puts limits on our monarchs in what they can say, what they can do, and the formal power that they wield. So in that sense, the monarchies are very different. In some other ways, they're comparable, and as we talked about, the costs are comparable. Just the idea of monarchy in and of itself, from a democratic standpoint, that those are comparable across the board, because they're of course the same fundamental question, right? And so in some ways they differ. In some ways I would find them comparable. It's hard to say one way or another, just straight up.
It has enough comparison as to work together in a more European perspective.
Sorry, what was that?
One could say it has enough comparison to work together in a European.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we work together on this issue because we find that it overlaps so to the extent that we can still find each other's experiences something that we can learn from. Absolutely.
Yeah. Graham is still here. I see you loading once in a while. The interesting thing is, talking about international cooperation, in the documentary, there's a very short part which you go to Brexit and the royal say in that. Is that one thing you would like to do, such a thing, Graham? As Brexit obviously is very controversy, a very big controversy in the national debate in Britain. Why should you bring this up? Obviously, you're going to, well, I think you'll lose some people who say, you know, we are very much against Brexit, or that's all right, you know, we speak out. It's kind of a hard point bringing that up.
Well, I mean, we don't take a view on Brexit. I've got my own views, but I mean, you know, the membership and supporter base of Republic is as divided as the rest of the UK on that issue. The film, the point made in the film really is that we were going through a very particular crisis. I'd say that there was a huge amount of political uncertainty, and of course, you know, we'll see what happens after the current coronavirus crisis. But I mean, the Brexit thing hasn't gone away. But certainly before the last election, there was a huge amount of uncertainty going on for 2 or 3 years. There was a risk of further electoral uncertainty if there was another hung parliament. There was a whole row about the fact that the Prime Minister suspended Parliament for quite a long time, which was then ruled to be unconstitutional. And the point about how that is relevant to what we're talking about is twofold. Firstly, we have an absent head of state. We have a head of state who has constitutional role to play, but is not willing to play it, because if she gets it wrong, then that could jeopardize the entire institution. But then we are faced with the prospect of King Charles, who is more inclined to play a role and to interfere. And if he was on the throne at that time, who knows what he might have done or said. And there needs to be clarity. You know, there needs to be a very clear role to play for head of state. And if there is a role to play, then that role has to be accountable if they get it wrong. So it was kind of saying, look, you know, it's this whole thing about fixing your roof when the sun is shining. The sun wasn't shining in Britain last year, and it was very clear that there are a whole load of holes in the roof, and we have really, the whole Brexit process exposed the monarchy as being rather pointless on one hand, but also not being this sort of independent arbiter. It was very much the Queen does what she's told by the Prime Minister, and so we sort of got away with it, partly because the government then went ahead and won a majority, and the constitutional issues sort of sorted themselves out, and because the Queen just did the bare minimum. But King Charles may have made that situation far worse, and may make a future situation far worse as well.
Yeah. We are talking about the documentary "The Man Who Shouldn't Be King" about Prince Charles. I was wondering why make a documentary about somebody who's not a monarch yet? Why not focus on the person of Elizabeth? Obviously, she has 50 somewhat years of governance, of being the head of state. Obviously, there's much more to say about that. Why focus on this position? Why focus on this person of Charles?
Well, I mean, the point is, it doesn't really matter who the monarch is. The situation is intolerable. The institution is indefensible. The Queen, however, her career, if you can put it like that, as head of state is behind her. She's 94. It's unlikely she'll be the Queen at the end of this decade. And the concern is about the future, and the message is really about we ought to choose our next head of state, whether we wait for the Queen to die or whether we do this tomorrow. It's going to be our next head of state that we want to choose. And King Charles, the prospect of King Charles, which that may happen tomorrow. It may happen. It may have already happened whilst we've been live on it. We don't know when that's going to happen, and that's a part of the argument. But King Charles is a very clear advertisement as to why the institution doesn't work, and why it is right, both in principle and in practice, that we should be able to choose our head of state. So he is an example, a way of framing the discussion that makes the wider point that the monarchy itself needs to go. So this isn't about saying, well, let's move him aside and have King William, for example. It's about saying that this is what happens when you have a monarchy. These are all the things that go wrong with the monarchy. And William might be the same. William might be the same, but then do it more subtly. I don't know. But, you can't leave it to the whims of chance. You have to give us a chance to choose who that next person's going to be.
It's still not sure if Charles will ever ascend the throne, because it's up to Elizabeth, whoever she appoints to be king.
No, the British Constitution is quite clear. It will be Charles. Only way, the Queen doesn't have a say in this. It's written in law that it's a very strange law. It's written in the about 300 years ago. It says that, or was it 200 years ago? It says that the monarch will be the heir and successor of the Electress of Hanover, an area of Germany where King George originated from. So that will be Charles. Now, the only way that there won't be Charles is either Charles declines the position, which he's never going to do, or he dies before his mum, in which case it becomes William. But no, it will be Charles, and it is instantaneous. The moment that a doctor arrives and declares that the Queen is dead, Charles is king, and there's the only way that you can stop that from happening is by getting rid of the monarchy during the Queen's reign.
Yeah. The only news we get about Charles, as obviously I've been trying to learn a little bit more about the person. The only news that you have is obviously the news as portrayed by the royal family. It's not very clear who this person is. Obviously, your documentary shows a lot about him. What might we expect? What might the Brits expect whenever he ascends the throne?
It's very hard to say. I mean, he has been outspoken over the last 40 years. He has made his opinions very clear. His opinions are not mainstream. They're rather eccentric. Sort of a conservative mysticism is one way of putting it. I think his ideal world is where we all go back to ploughing the fields and he lives in his grand manor. But I think also his personality has been revealed in various ways in terms of being rather thin-skinned and defensive, and demanding deference and so on, being very intolerant of criticism. So the only question really is whether that comes out publicly when he's king, or whether it is something that is kept private. He has been compared to Trump, not quite so crass and not quite so brash, but certainly sort of someone who perhaps hasn't grown up enough and doesn't like to be challenged. So it depends on whether people around him can keep him quiet. But even if he's kept quiet, then you have questions about what he's doing in behind closed doors. And we face a very real danger where a government that is in power at the time that he becomes king has a particular policy, and then 2 years later it decides to change that policy, and all of a sudden that policy is in line with what Prince Charles has been talking about over the last 40 years. And the question will obviously be asked, why was that changed? Was it changed because the government looked at the evidence and decided that was the right thing for the country? Or was it because Prince Charles has been leaning on them, making various threats of causing them embarrassment or whatever, or just simply talking to sycophantic ministers who love to do the king's bidding? So, there are serious concerns there about what he's going to be like, and he's not someone to be trusted to do the role in any sort of appropriate manner.
Yeah. We just a couple of questions ago we discussed Brexit. You said obviously his mother is a little bit more diplomatical about Brexit. I can see getting a very, very strong stance on that could potentially threaten her position as a whole. Charles isn't. I understood from your answer earlier.
No, Charles hasn't said anything about Brexit. None of them have directly. They know, they don't get involved in the most controversial issues very often. It's their own pet issues. And this is quite telling, though. I mean, Prince Charles's lobbying has been revealed over the years, on and off, but it's always his own agenda. It's not the issues that are most pressing for the country. So he never wavers from what he's interested in. And I don't know that Brexit will make a lot of difference for them. Personally, I suppose they have an opinion, but I don't suppose it's particularly well thought out or informed. The Queen has made interventions on these issues from time to time, but they're very, very carefully worded, and they are on the advice of the government. So famously, a few days before the Scottish referendum in 2014, she made a comment about everyone having to think very carefully about what they decide, and this is taken as a cue to vote for remaining as part of the UK, and that certainly upset a lot of people in Scotland. And there have been similar comments over the years, but they try and avoid the most controversial issues.
Yeah, we are still debating. We are 1 hour and 7 minutes on our way in this first internet debate among Republicans in Europe. Thank you for your comment, Liddy. As comments go in and come in, we would like to use this opportunity to answer any question might you have about the monarchy, about this documentary, or about republicanism. As I saw the documentary, and I now have seen it twice, I must say that this really pictures a rather grim image of the monarchy. One would expect, with such a documentary coming out, why support the monarchy in the first place? As Charles has a very strong, he uses his power. It costs a lot of money to maintain the system. Do you expect after this movie comes out, more and more people joining in, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the purpose of it, really, and I think it is persuasive. I think people have watched it and thought very clearly, well, okay, this isn't what I thought the monarchy was all about. Most people in Britain don't know what the monarchy is about, and they don't know the details of things like the duchy. And I'd say, I know we're running out of time, but this book has just come out by Norman Baker, who is a former MP, and he's been saying the same thing to me recently, that people that read it that aren't necessarily Republicans are persuaded fairly quickly that this is a problem, because they read for the first time some of these awful details about the corruption, the misuse of money, the abuse of power, and so on. So it's the big challenge for us, and also an opportunity for us as campaigners, is to get the facts and the arguments in front of people. And I think that people are very open to persuasion once they see how bad the monarchy actually is.
One could say that whereas republicanism is very much something about argument, about reasonable argument, whereas supporters of the monarchy tend to lean more towards emotion. It's always been there. It's historic. It's culture. It defines who we are. Does a movie like this shouldn't it rather, instead of being very argumental and very factual, or being the emotion?
Well, I think it does touch on that as well. I mean, there are emotional arguments, the principled argument, but people get angry about misuse of power. They get angry about misuse of taxpayers' money. So I think it generates that emotion as well. So, but there needs to be two sides of the argument. It can't simply be facts without the emotion. It can't be emotion without the facts. And I think that we try to tackle both of those in the film.
Yeah. One of the very last questions I have is, I found the title rather peculiar. You are the Republican Society of Great Britain, and you question yourself whether he should be king or not. Is that something you'd like to debate? Are you not in favor of just abolishing the whole thing as it is, instead of just debating whether he ought to be a good king or not?
Well, the point is that arguing about whether Charles is king is a way of saying that the monarchy should be abolished. So it's not, it is a way of framing that particular discussion, because what it does is highlight certain serious practical issues. It highlights the principle. It highlights the failure of the monarchy as a whole system of choosing someone, that you're going to end up with someone who is entirely unsuitable for the role. And so it's a way of saying this is not an institution that works in the modern society. Quite frankly, it has never worked, but in the interest of the ordinary people. But it's not sustainable. So it's kind of a way of saying, look, this isn't about this guy not being a good king. Let's get a good king from somewhere else. It's about saying this is what the monarchy gives you. You're going to get it whether you like it or not. And the way to have someone else is to have an election.
All right, thank you very much. With us are Graham Smith of the Republican Society in Great Britain and Ola Nyqvist of the Swedish Republican Society. We've been debating the documentary "The Man Who Shouldn't Be King," which is out on YouTube for everyone to see. It's a very interesting documentary, I must say. Rather professionally made. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on King's Day in the Netherlands to debate this. For everybody following us on YouTube and on Facebook, thank you very much. Please leave all your questions. Might you still have them? We will try to answer them in a different way on a different channel. I hope this might be a start of further debate with our European friends, European Republican friends, I might say. Thank you very much. The sun is still out. I think I will enjoy a little bit of sun today. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and
thank you, Lars.
Each other very soon again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please leave your questions, but ask us as well what kind of arguments, what kind of themes you would like to have debated in next time we go live. Thank you very much for following us, and see you next time.